prepared to share that with the rest of the people of our continent. As the University of South Africa, we are ready and willing to make the University of South Africa's own reputation as an academic institution in Africa, in the service of Africa and Africa's own intellectual and academic aspirations. And so today, as the Pro-Vice Chancellor, Professor Mandla Makhanya, has said, is a very, very special event. So there will be studies, there will be postgraduate degrees, there will be doctoral degrees, there will be short learning courses, there will be opportunities for young people to come together to meet and discuss around the table. There will be opportunities for business people. There will be opportunities and workshops for people from different parts of this continent to come together to meet. There will be creative and critical thinking, not about the past, but about the future. And so I am particularly delighted to be here, and I now wish to take a short opportunity to introduce Dr. Thabo Mbeki. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, Dr. Thabo Mbeki completed a degree in economics, a Master of Arts degree in economics at the University of Sussex. And he has received several honorary degrees from South Africa and other parts of the world. Among those, he's received an honorary degree from the University of South Africa. Hence, we insist that he deserves to be called Dr. Mbeki, at least by us. I'm very delighted that, as the academic tradition requires, he doesn't call himself Dr. Mbeki. The tradition does require that if you've got an honorary degree, you never put the doctor before your name. Tradition requires that you put the degree PhD behind your name. And in brackets, you write HC, honoris causa. Dr. Mbeki was responsible, as we all know, or rather he has spent his life in the African National Congress. He was active as a young person in the African Students Association. He was active in the ANC Youth League. He was involved in the diplomatic structures of the ANC in exile for many years. He's reputed to have had a hand in the emerging consensus about breaking the deadlock and bringing an end to apartheid in our country. He was part of the negotiations process before 1993 and after. He, as we all know, spoke on behalf of all of us on the 8th of May, 1996, when he received the new Constitution of the Republic of South Africa. And he did so by presenting with amazing eloquence his own thought about what it was to be an African. So when he stood up to say, "I am an African," I'm glad to say all the leaders of the other political parties, some of them may never have thought they would ever do so before, stood up one by one and said, "I am an African." And one had every reason to believe that we are well and truly in a new South Africa. Dr. Mbeki served as Deputy President under President Mandela, and later served as President for almost 2 terms. Since then, he has been very active in work for peace and reconciliation in Africa on behalf of the African Union and the United Nations. His work in Zimbabwe and the Darfur is one that he has now become very well known for. It does give us great pride and honor to have His Excellency Dr. Thabo Mbeki to present his lecture today. Welcome, Dr. Mbeki.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. I hope you'll have a bit of patience as I deliver this lecture. 10 years ago, in the year 2000, marking the close of the 20th century, the World Bank published a report provocatively entitled, "Can Africa Claim the 21st Century?" Seeking to answer this question, the report said that the question of whether sub-Saharan Africa can claim the 21st century is complex and provocative. Our central message is yes, Africa can claim the new century, but this is a qualified yes. Conditional on Africa's ability, aided by its development partners, to overcome the development traps that kept it confined to a vicious cycle of underdevelopment, conflict, and untold human suffering for most of the 20th century. In their preface, the authors said this report proposes strategies for ushering in self-reinforcing processes of economic, political, and social development. And they said that progress is crucial on 4 fronts: improving governance and resolving conflict, investing in people, increasing competitiveness and diversifying economies, and reducing aid dependence and strengthening partnerships. And they said claiming the future involves enormous challenges, not least of which is resolving the problems of the past. Much of Africa's recent economic history can be seen as a process of marginalization, first of people, then of governments. Reversing this process requires better accountability, balanced by economic empowerment of civic society, including women and the poor, and firms relative to governments, and of aid recipients relative to donors. Without this shift in power and accountability, it will be difficult to offer the incentives Africa needs to accelerate the development and break free of poverty. It is probably true that all these World Bank observations are in themselves correct and unexceptionable. However, notable by its absence in these observations is an element I consider to be of vital importance if Africa is to claim the 21st century: the need for Africa to recapture the intellectual space to define its future, and therefore the imperative to develop its intellectual capital. This is the first point I'd like to make concerning what we need to do to ensure that we claim the 21st century. The lecture series we begin today, as Vice Chancellor has just said, sponsored by the Thabo Mbeki Institute for African Leadership, a joint initiative of the UNISA and the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, is dedicated to the African Renaissance and also serves to celebrate Africa Day. The tasks we continue to confront in this regard were identified even as the Organization of African Unity was established in 1963. In this context, this is what the Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia said when he opened the conference which established the OAU. And he said, "We stand today on the stage of world affairs before the audience of world opinion. We have come together to assert our role in the direction of world affairs and to discharge our duty to the great continent whose 250 million people we lead. The task on which we have embarked, the making of Africa, will not wait. We must act to shape and mold the future and leave our imprint on events as they pass into history." And he said, "We seek at this meeting to determine whither we are going and to chart the course of our destiny. It is no less important that we know whence we came. An awareness of our past is essential to the establishment of our personality and our identity as Africans." And he said that thousands of years ago, civilizations flourished in Africa, which suffer not at all by comparison with those of other continents. In these centuries, Africans were politically free and economically independent. Their social patterns were their own and their cultures truly indigenous. The obscurity which enshrouds the centuries which elapsed between those earliest days and the rediscovery of Africa are being gradually dispersed. What is certain is that during those long years, Africans were born, lived, and died. Men on other parts of this earth occupied themselves with their own concerns and in their conceit proclaimed that the world began and ended at their horizons. All unknown to them, Africa developed in its own pattern, growing in its own life, and in the 19th century, finally re-emerged into the world's consciousness, unquote. Reading these words today, there can be no doubt about the answer those who had gathered in Addis Ababa in 1963 would have given if they had been asked the question, can Africa claim the 21st century? The critical importance of the awareness of our past and its relevance to the establishment of our personality and identity as Africans was identified by the very earliest among our modern intelligentsia. 100 years before Haile Selassie addressed the African political leaders assembled in Addis Ababa in 1963. In August 1862, the Reverend Theo Soga, educated at the Lovedale Institution in the Eastern Cape and at the University of Glasgow in Scotland, where he trained in theology, started publishing what I believe was the first African newspaper in our country, managed and edited by Africans, called Indaba. In his editorial comment in the first edition of the paper, Theo Soga said, "I see this newspaper as a secure container that will preserve our history, our stories, our wisdom. The deeds of the nation are worth more than our cattle herds, money, and even food. Let the elderly pour their knowledge into this container. Let all our stories, folk and fairy tales, traditional views, and everything that was ever seen, heard, done, and all customs, let them be reported and kept in the national container. Did we not form nations in the past? Did we not have our traditional leaders? What has happened to the wisdom of these leaders? Did we not have poets? Where is their poetry? Was there no witchcraft in the past? Did we not fight wars? Who were the heroes? Where is the distinctive regalia of the royal regiment? Did we not hunt? Why was the meat of the chest of the rhino and the buffalo reserved for royalty? Where are the people to teach us our history, our knowledge, and our wisdom? Let even the spirit of the departed return to bless us with the great gift of our heritage, which we must preserve." Theo Soga wrote those words 16 years before the end of the last colonial war to subjugate the indigenous people in the Cape Province. He had seen that despite the continuing fierce resistance of the Africans, colonialism was bound to emerge victorious. To guarantee its victory, it had started and was determined to wipe out the history, the customs, the self-worth, the identity, and the dignity of the African oppressed. Soga knew that if this was allowed to happen, it would break the will of the colonized to continue the struggle to achieve their liberation. Hence his call, let even the spirit of the departed return to bless us with the great gift of our heritage, which we must preserve. Confirming what he had in mind was the ultimate liberation of Africa. In a May 11, 1865 article in the King Williamstown Gazette and Kafrerian Banner, entitled, "What is the Destiny of the Kaffir Race?" Theo Soga wrote, "Africa was of God given to the race of Ham. I find the Negro from the days of the old Assyrians downwards, keeping his individuality and distinctiveness among the wreck of empires and the revolution of ages. I find him enslaved. I find him in this condition for many a day in the West Indian Islands, in Northern and South America, and in the South American colonies of Spain and Portugal. Until the Negro is doomed against all history and experience, until his God-given inheritance of Africa has been taken finally from him, I shall never believe in the total extinction of his brethren along the southern limits of the land of Ham." Important contemporary members of the African intelligentsia have also understood the challenges Theo Soga posed and their responsibility in this regard. For example, the Ghanaian novelist and thinker Ai Kwei-Armah has said we need to regain knowledge of ourselves, the something that we are. To do that, we have first of all to end the addiction to the poisons that put us to sleep. Secondly, we need to cultivate healing values that will help us